Good evening from Wolfville and Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Welcome to the next of our virtual event series and on International Women's Day. So happy International Women's Day to everybody out there. My name is Una Proudfoot, and I am the Executive Director of Alumni Affairs in the Office of Advancement. I am delighted to be here this evening to talk with our guest, Dr. Lesley Frank, class of 1995, about her book, Out of Milk, Infant Food Insecurity in a Rich Nation, which explores the experiences of mothers struggling to feed their children and the policy gaps that put babies at risk of going hungry in a high-income nation. Dr. Frank is Acadia University's new Canada Research Chair in Food, Health and Social Justice and is a leading scholar of family poverty and food insecurity issues. Her work has been featured on CBC's The Current, and she is a regular media commentator locally on matters related to family poverty. She is a long-standing author of the annual Child and Family Poverty Report Card for Nova Scotia. Dr. Frank will highlight three storylines this evening: how breastfeeding is experienced as a food security strategy, how structural inequities render breastfeeding a non-sustainable food system, and the struggle to afford infant formula, leading to forage for formula from charity and social media platforms. So pretty heavy topic content that we'll be sharing this evening with each other. Before we get started, though, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. I've already covered to please mute your microphones to avoid background noise, and also to disable your cameras. I've been told that affects bandwidth. As I say, I still don't know what that means, but also as we are recording, it helps with the quality of the recording as well. We welcome your questions, absolutely, during all of these events, and you can do that one of two ways. Certainly at a point in time after the presentation, you can unmute your microphone and even enable your camera and ask your question directly to Dr. Frank, or you can launch your chat function. If you're not familiar with that, it's an icon at the top of your screen, which looks like a text box. I always liken it to the cartoon strips that I used to read as a kid. You just click on that and it will launch your chat function, and you can type your question in the chat function. I'll keep an eye on them, and if I see questions posed there, I will do it audibly for you when there's a moment with the presentation. And then the last thing is we have entered all of your names into a draw, and we'll announce the winner at the end of the session this evening. The giveaway is, of course, a copy of Dr. Frank's book. So we'll get that in the mail to you as we announce the winners, as I say, at the end of the presentation and the question and answer. And now, please join me in welcoming our very own Acadia alum, Dr. Lesley Frank. Over to you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you, the Acadia Alumni Office, for inviting me to share in this virtual event series. And I'm really happy to be doing it on International Women's Day. So we all have women in our lives, if we're not women ourselves, to celebrate. Tonight, I'm going to share some insights from my new book, Out of Milk. But before I begin, I thought I would share a bit about the origin story. What really made me interested in this topic of infant food insecurity, which I will explain what I mean by that as I go along. So Sandra, I'm going to be on slide 2. I can't see what Sandra's doing, so I'm just going to go with that. So yes, I graduated from Acadia from an MA in sociology in 1995, and I went to work for what is now called the Kids Action Program here in the Annapolis Valley. And I coordinated a prenatal and early infancy outreach program that was targeted to families living in low-income circumstances. So I was directly responsible for prenatal and postnatal nutrition-based programming for mothers, which included such things as breastfeeding promotion and support, along with things like a monthly food box delivery, transportation support, prenatal education. And during that time, I also had 4 babies of my own. And this is not an exaggeration, but I breastfed for 11 years straight. And perhaps, you know, my rough calculations mean that I produced about 200 2,800 liters of human milk. So you can sort of imagine that piled up. Yeah, and I often found myself, though, grappling with what appeared to be a paradox. Why many of the women I worked with, mothers who could least afford not to breastfeed because they had difficulties affording the alternative, were more likely to do so. So when there's difficulty affording food, one might expect mothers to breastfeed as a means to maximize food for their infant and also for their family, as breastfeeding is thought to provide free food. Thus, even if a household is food insecure, by breastfeeding, infants at least would be food secure, as they would have access to reliable, readily available, and affordable and nutritious food. Yet, like I said, there appears to be a breastfeeding paradox, and at the time, I couldn't really explain this paradox. But paradoxes are always great places to generate research question, and this question sort of needled at me for years. Later, I turned my attention to interrogating that paradox, which has sort of set the trajectory of my research for years to come. Next slide, Sandra. So what do I mean by food insecurity? So food, eating, and health are all implicated in systems of inequality. 70 years after the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and despite Canada being a wealthy nation, household food insecurity, meaning inadequate access to food due to financial constraint, has plagued Canada. We know that 4.4 million Canadians, which includes 1.2 million children in Canada, are living in food insecure households. This encompasses a range of experiences, from psychological dimensions of worry about being able to afford food, to both qualitative and quantitative dimensions of food deprivation because of not having enough money. Food insecurity is a serious public health problem in Canada, and that's where the lion's share of the research around it lies. It negatively impacts physical, mental, and social health, and it costs our healthcare system considerably. And it disproportionately affects families with children. And this has been made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic. The first 1,000 days of life from conception to 2 years is now considered the most critical time for optimal growth and development through the entire life course. Yet, children under 1 in Canada are more likely to live in poverty than any other age of child. Addressing the effects of poverty and food insecurity on children's health is urgent. And this is particularly a concern for Nova Scotia, which reports one of the highest rates of child poverty in the country and one of the highest rates of household food insecurity. And outside of the territories, it has the highest proportion of children living in food insecure homes. Yet very little attention has been paid to the effects of food insecurity on infants, despite that they would experience food insecurity in unique ways due to the fact that they eat in particular ways and only a few food substance in their early year of their first year. Our national nutrition surveillance tools do not consider them either when they calculate childhood food insecurity prevalence. Next slide. So this book brings together findings from a few studies on this topic, the first of which was an exploratory qualitative study in Nova Scotia that sought to tease out the relationship between food insecurity and its effects on infant feeding practices. So Out of Milk reveals, as Una said, the experiences of mothers struggling to feed their children and the policy gaps that put babies at risk of going hungry in Canada. And it has 3 storylines, which I'm going to share a bit about. And Una already sort of covered them, so I'll go through them. So next slide. So the first chapter is about the first storyline, how breastfeeding is routinely constructed as a pathway to infant food insecurity. It's been conceptualized as the quintessential sustainable food system. For example, on Food Secure Canada's website, breastfeeding is described as a food system where, and this is in the words on the website, the consumer is in control, the food is designed to meet the specific needs of the consumer, and changes in quality and quantity of those needs change over time. There is no excess packaging, no fossil fuels used in the production or distribution of the food. There is a direct, not to say intimate, relationship between producer and consumer. The producer needs to be healthy and well nourished, or the system does not work. So, in my interviewing mothers, what I found was that food insecure mothers did conceive of breastfeeding as a food system, not just a health practice, discussing it with food system like language. So as Lorraine said, me, where I'm breastfeeding, I don't have to worry about the milk. It's free. There's no risk of cross-contamination. It's there, it's ready, it's the right amount. It's the perfect food. It adapts to your baby's needs. It's amazing. It's a big comfort knowing that my son's going to have milk when he needs it, any time of day or night. Contained in this, we see a lack of worry about food access. And for Hannah, there's no affordable alternative. As she said, I knew that there was no money. I wasn't going to be able to afford formula. I needed to produce enough milk. I have to. And across the board, sort of this research showed, of all the women interviewed for the book, high initiation rates across them. And they were all food insecure mothers, due to worry about food insecurity and concerns for their infant health. So if this is the case, why a breastfeeding paradox? So next slide. Well, Mary describes it well in her quote, which was much more common, this feeling of insecurity about breastfeeding as a sustainable food system due to maternal and household food insecurity. So it was like the outcome of household food insecurity. She said, I don't know if what I was producing would be really enough nutrition-wise, if it was, how would you put it, healthy enough for him, giving him what he needed. Plus, in order to be able to produce milk, the mother needs to be food secure, and you don't have that all the time, and the situation could change for you on a drop of a dime. Mothers were worried about their own food consumption being inadequate, not enough to support lactation. They talked about insufficient milk and poor quality milk, didn't conceive of themselves as able to produce quality food because of their own poor eating, because of food insecurity. And this qualitative research suggests that food insecurity contributes to early cessation of breastfeeding. Mother stories, in fact, challenge us to think critically about the possible biological reality of poor milk supply in high-income countries, affected by environmental, social, and emotional toxins. And I'm not a biologist, but as a social scientist, I was able to explore with colleagues at the University of Toronto the breastfeeding paradox using national health data. And we conducted, and this is what is in this little figure on this slide, a cross-sectional study of over 10,000 Canadian women who answered the Canadian Community Health Survey across a number of years. And we explored the relationship between food insecurity and meeting breastfeeding recommendations. What we found was that women with food insecurity were no less likely than others to initiate breastfeeding, similar to what I heard in the stories for this book. However, relative to food secure women, food insecure mothers had significantly lower odds of exclusive breastfeeding to 4 months. So this research, of course, is now being replicated in many other high-income countries. And it also sort of echoes the qualitative stories in the book, which just shout out to mixed methods of research. Now, next slide. So what leads to food insecurity during this time of feeding the baby? Let's take a look at the economics of feeding. So this is from a paper recently, somewhat recently published in the Canadian Journal for Public Health, which I did with colleagues at the Mount St. Vincent University. And what I'm going to take you through really briefly is a family scenario in Nova Scotia based on data from 2015. This first monthly expenses box that I just showed you is on the left side is the monthly expenses of a two-parent family on income assistance in this province with a 3-month-old breastfed infant and a 4-year-old child. So they have a total of income coming into their house, including government transfers from child tax benefits, of $2,487 a month. Now, when we look at their monthly expenses, we see this is not including food. Their expenses total $2,244 a month. So therefore, their funds remaining for food is $243 a month. So we know, because of our food costing research, what the cost of a basic nutritious diet would be for this family that includes a lactating mother and so the breastfed infant, and that's how the breastfed infant is, of course, fed. What would be left at the end of the month should this family purchase that basic nutritious diet is zero. It's in fact negative $575 a month. So on to the next slide. Now, what if they were in a different income scenario? So maternity leave still leaves you, maternity leave based on a minimum wage job previous to taking the leave, leaves you still negative in the whole monthly if you bought a basic nutritious diet. And it's only the scenario we created around a $15 an hour wage that brings people over the zero line into the black. On to the next slide. Now, what if that baby was formula fed and not breastfed? In these three scenarios, you can see the bottom line, and it's in fact not that different. The family is $30 a month less in the hole in the red columns if the baby was formula fed. So this is we costed in a random sample of infant formulas from stores across the province, what the cost of formula, the lowest cost of formula, powdered formula for a 3-month-old baby based on its food consumption requirements. And as you can see, the qualitative stories of the book help explain this as well. She says, Beverly said, I wouldn't say that there's more money for food not buying formula. It was never put into the equation. So it's not like I have an extra $100 for groceries. It was never there to begin with. So they're in the hole. So the idea that breastfeeding provides free food is we need to sort of tease that apart a bit. So on to the next slide. So early cessation of breastfeeding in food insecure families aligns with what happens next, which is difficulty affording infant formula. And this plays out in a number of ways. For some families, it meant the baby was made a priority for food purchases. The baby's food was bought first. Others were secondary, or perhaps, went to the food bank to feed the older children. But for families that actually relied on food charity regularly, and that would be many families, as you can remember, the hundreds of dollars in the hole if you're on income assistance. The infant in the household is actually at considerable risk because formula is not always available through charity sources. And we shouldn't be surprised that infant formula is one of the most stolen food products in Canada. And you can see in that picture that it's behind bars, which is increasingly the case in cities and inner cities in particular. I don't see it yet in rural Canada, but I mean, that might be coming. So this quote from Heather gives us a sense of the difficulties of finding formula when you have no money to buy it. She said you can sometimes get formula at the food bank or at the church or at the Family Resource Center, but my last resort would be a friend. I think I might have gotten it once from a public health nurse. You take what you get. It's a matter of being able to feed the baby at all. This is what I got, so this is what they get. So a couple of years ago, I conducted a snapshot of interviews with community-based organizations across the country to see what the typical responses to such a food need are. I talked to food banks and I talked to family resource centers. And what I found, just like Heather suggests, is that a family in need would pretty much have to go foraging for formula in a way. And they would encounter a continuum of possible outcomes depending on the organization that they went to. Next slide. And in this diagram, sort of, it's too small to see, I know that, but what it does is map out the typical responses to infant food needs that you might find at a food bank across the country. They range from, oh, we don't do that, to well-developed and securely funded specialized infant food banks. Most often, however, is what's in the middle in this continuum. If it's either we have it, we'll give it to you if we've got it, and we'll make sure that it's not expired, which kind of leads to sort of random and inconsistent product that people would encounter, not consistently available, but sometimes they'll say we always have something, but that something is often unpredictable because it's based on random donations, as much of the food in a food bank is. So the reasons for these responses, of course, range from a belief that it's not needed in the community, or they don't get those donations, or they don't have an expertise in formula. They think it's a health thing that they don't want to be involved with, or it's actually too expensive for them to purchase with cash donations. It's a high-priced commodity, or there's pressure to not have it because it wouldn't be breastfeeding friendly. But then there's others that say we've created a system for it because we have a food justice value that everyone needs access to food, sort of upholding the first principle of ethical food banking code of Food Banks Canada, which is that they will provide food and other assistance to those needing help regardless of race, nation, ethnic origin, citizenship, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, income source, and age. So on to the next slide, just to give you a little bit of context about some of the interesting sort of politics behind this, is that there are breastfeeding advocacy groups that actually publicly discourage the donation of formula by food banks, and based on that it's conceptualized as a violation of the World Health Organization's International Code of Breast Milk Marketing. And this is an example on the slide of something that was on a website of theirs in 2005, discouraging people from donating formula to food banks. So it's a sort of it, and this is an interesting dilemma, right? Because Canada's approach to food insecurity is not to ensure livable incomes through the social welfare system. It is to leave it to charity organizations. So what does this mean for a baby that drinks formula as their only source of food when infant formula is contested, as it were not to give it out for free, and if we do, it's a violation of the Code of Breast Milk Marketing. So on to the next slide, and I'm just about done. So mothers, of course, so you can't get food from a food bank to feed your baby. You can't afford it. You can't get it from a food bank. So what next, right? So mothers introduced me to this digital arena of foraging, where they sought help online as the only alternative to finding formula when charity failed. A quick internet search can confirm a plethora of online groups serving as social networking mechanisms of material support. One Facebook page's description makes this clear. A group called Mothers Helping Mothers, which states, "Today made me realize once again how little help the government is to mothers." This is briefly introduced in the book in the final chapter, and it spurred me to conduct a much larger study on this phenomena, which I'm currently just about finished writing up. So I collected, well, really, my lovely students collected every Kijiji ad about infant food across Canada over a period of 11 months, and a snapshot of Facebook from Facebook groups in Nova Scotia to analyze what's going on in terms of infant food exchange practices online. And what I found, and once I analyzed them and mapped that out, is this peer-to-peer exchange network where people are selling, trading, giving away food, and seeking infant food. This environment, this online food environment, reveals much about the secondhand economy in general and the use of social media for peer support. It reveals an ethic of care among mothers, and it also reveals serious problems of unequal food access, potential food risk, and increased chances of surveillance of the poor as they make public their desperations for food. Mothers are also selling unusable infant food for needed small amounts of money. They're trading infant food, perhaps food that they got through a violation of the Code of Breast Milk Substitute Marketing Code, because they got direct formula from the formula company, and they use that as a currency to get the formula they need online. Some of the formula online is opened with only a few scoops gone. And people are in such desperation that they get in, like they find transportation across the city to get it because it's only $5. So overall, this research demonstrates how household food insecurity impedes breastfeeding and optimal formula feeding alike. And infant food insecurity is in fact a result of a succession of public policy failures, beginning with weak income security policy and programs and weak maternity protection for the early parenting years and the work of feeding the baby. It illustrates the need for adequate state maternity protection, what I would call a new maternity social contract to support access to food and nutrition at this critical time. Last slide. So just to tell you, all of this has led to some very exciting news for me, which is being appointed as the new Canada Research Chair in Food, Health and Social Justice at Acadia. So I will be taking forward some of these learnings, and I have more research questions that have come out of it than I can cope with at this time. But my goal is to fill some knowledge and measurement gaps on family and childhood food insecurity beyond the stages of infancy, but sort of across the life course of children. Right now, we're working on developing survey indicators to capture infant food insecurity for ongoing research that can be part of national nutrition surveillance that actually consider the ways in which babies are fed and the way in which food insecurity impacts them, and are planning to move into doing a fairly large analysis of family and childhood food insecurity with pooled Canadian Community Health Survey data to look specifically at families and children, and working on partnership development for emerging projects. So if anybody has any questions about that, they can, and I'll just stop now.
Thank you so much, Lesley. That's, my inkling is to say, that's great. But it's really not great. I mean, the content itself, rather, is not great. Just one second. There we go. But the amount of information and I remember a quote during my research days that something along the lines of, whenever you generate more questions, that's the best scenario, right? So I think you've more than accomplished that. We have a couple of questions that came through in our registration form, so I'm going to start with those, and then I have quite a few that I've jotted down. I don't want to hog the airtime though, so I would just want to remind everyone who's on the call that you are more than welcome to either unmute yourselves and ask the questions directly. I know that there are some past students of yours on the line, so they may want to say hello as well. Or you can put it in the chat function if you're not comfortable asking the question directly. So just a couple that came in, Lesley, if I may. The first one is, what do rural mothers do as opposed to urban mothers? And I guess the question is in the context, sort of generally speaking, about access to food.
Well, it's interesting. Most of the women that, well, no, I would say maybe half and half of the women interviewed for the book were rural and urban. So, but food insecurity is experienced differently by rural women, especially in relation to this topic. So, for example, I think, I mean, if you're a food insecure mother that's using infant formula, I think there might be one can of formula in my grocery store that's 5 kilometers away from me, and I live rurally. Like, so there is, it is hard to find in small rural, like retail outlets, for example, and it is of higher price. So food in general is more expensive in rural areas than in urban areas. We know that from our food costing research, and so there's issues just around finding the food you need and the cost of the food you need that varies. But there's also problems around access to services in general, which cost more, especially in the early years of having a new baby. Well, I mean, we don't even have access to midwifery at all in the valley. I mean, people are traveling. I mean, so in the early years of that problem, people were like traveling to places that had access to services and staying there and trying to get what they needed. So the problems of poverty are similar, yet experienced slightly different depending on where you live. In Halifax, for example, you can there's one food bank that has less strict visiting rules, and you can go to it when you need it. But most food banks restrict your use to with a certain catchment area, and you can go once every 6 to 8 weeks, and it's only opened, a few hours a week, or every 2 weeks. The food bank in Wolf is only open every 2 weeks. So, there's not less services and then less support services. And of course, we have transportation issues and whatnot. So just a little bit of an answer.
And what about the difference, or how is it experienced by student parents? So sort of that added variable of being in school. So as I say, just to clarify, so students who are also parents.
Yeah, I mean, none of the women that were interviewed for the book were students, but there's certainly been lots of research on student food insecurity, of which I have done some, and I have for example, my honors student, Janique, is doing research on that right now, particularly on international students. We know that students experience food insecurity in unique ways as well. So it's like that's what the qualitative research allows us to understand, is the unique ways that certain groups of people experience a phenomena in depth. So students, for example, have things like they are much more likely to have income shock. So their money comes at certain periods of time. They have to spread it out over long periods of time. And then if something goes wrong, right, you didn't get what you thought you were going to get, it throws you into what we call an income shock. Also, students are subjected to really high housing costs. They're more likely to be housing insecure when they're living near universities, as the rent costs are, rental accommodations are tailored to students. So if you're a family if you're a student with children, you have that added burden of, where can I live that I can afford, especially if you have many children. I don't know how you would find a place to afford in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, for example, when rooms are, when like people are renting things by the room for $500 dollars a month. So I mean, also students are, student parents experience all the things that I already talked about. That is similar, but then they have the added uh, challenges of the things I mentioned around income, right?
Yeah, and that's something that I think about with the food bank that we have on campus, and I only went in once or twice, usually pretty much around the time that it opened, just to get sort of a feel for how it was going to work and what it looked like and what contents it had, and I never would have thought to look and see if there was access to formula. So I wonder if we've ever had it in the food bank on campus. I'm going to switch. What was that?
I said I somehow doubt it.
Yeah.
And it's not always available. Many food banks, I mean, the food banks are quite different. Of course, they're charity organizations that are run by different, they're like nonprofit organizations. So how they roll out their services will look different. It's not a government service, right? Where if it was access to formula was a government service, then it would be something that people would be entitled to. It would be something that would be reliable. Of course, it's contested whether that is a good way to go, because there's the fear that it will impede successful breastfeeding if we make formula more available to people. But it certainly is available. I mean, there's other countries that have such programs, like the United States, like the UK.
So, so now you've switched gears twice, and I'm like, I've got so many questions I want to ask, and I don't know which way to go next. So I just need to go back to that comment about impeding the breast milk marketing function angle, however you describe it. And when I think breast milk marketing, I mean, I think back to my management degree that I did many, many moons ago, and I think about the word marketing and how, in my way of thinking, it's always around how you convince somebody to buy something is always how I went, where I went in my head with it. So when you say breast milk marketing, I mean, I understand that you're talking about encouraging women to breastfeed versus formula feeding them. To get to a point where food insecurity is, or sorry, breast milk marketing.
It's formula marketing is what I mean. So breast milk substitute marketing.
Okay, right.
So it's and so one of the techniques of marketing for infant formula is to provide free samples, right? So this notion of providing free food to people, which is what charity does. The reason that there's sort of disagreement on infant formula being in food charity, in food banks, is because it's conceived of as giving free formula. So it's like marketing the formula. Now, others would argue that it's not that at all, right?
Right.
It's and would argue that, infants have a right to food. This is the only food that they eat, and we need to ensure they have access to it. And it's actually a bit of a misreading of the code, because the code itself recognizes that there's a legitimate need for infant formula, but it just needs to be procured in a way that it doesn't impede breastfeeding. So, so not the free giving of samples. That's a marketing tactic. Yeah. But we could ensure that people have access to it that needs it, that has nothing to do with free samples. It's just that we're stuck in this problem that food insecurity in Canada is not addressed by any government body. It's only addressed by the community and people trying to figure it out through food banks.
So this concept of let's just get infants fed in any way we can, it's not a thing.
No.
Right. And I'm trying really hard not to have facial leakages during this conversation, but I'm struggling with this look of wow, and appreciating how you're bringing this information to the forefront, because I said to you when we were talking about doing this session, I said I'm going to learn so much, because it's not anything that I've thought about. So I'm kind of jumping ahead to one of the last questions I was going to ask, but I'm going to go there now before I come back to some of the differences in the different countries that you've just referenced.
Mm-hmm.
Can I even just sit here and say to you, what can we do? Is there some sort of call to action that you can say to, the 20 people that are listening to you right now, in terms of, I don't know, donations, or helping with policy development, or, I don't know, talking to municipal politicians and hoping that maybe that starts a conversation that then gets to a provincial level? Anything that you can throw out there.
Yeah, well, reviewers of the book have said the book is a call to action. They've said it is a call to action. We have been in conversations about food insecurity for a long time in this country. There has been no public policy that addresses it. We have left it to charity organizations that are overburdened, and are even more so overburdened now with the fallout of this pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
That and yet the government says, well, what we're going to do is we're going to give more money to the charities so they can do more of that work. So what we can do is to say, we know that food charity doesn't work. It will never solve the problem of food insecurity. It doesn't even meet the food needs of the food insecure. And talking back to students are the least likely to go to a food bank, yet we continue to create these food-based systems of trying to address the problem. What we need are income-based solutions to the problem. People need to be able to make their own decisions about how they feed their baby. You can't make a choice about something if you have no means to make that choice. And I would say the solution is in what I meant by a new maternity contract. If these times of life when you have a baby are one of the times of life that are most important nutritionally, both for mother and for baby. They are also the time of life when we have the least income. So when you have, the women that I interviewed for the book didn't even have access to maternity leave. So that's not a solution for them. But maternity leaves or parental leaves that are based on your previous labor market attachments are problematic. And there's other ways we can do such leaves that allows people to do the work of feeding the baby no matter how they choose to feed the baby. And they have the economic security to do so. And so, for example, maternity leave and parental leave in Quebec is much easier to get and much more in income. So it's not a surprise that the child poverty rate in Quebec is the lowest in the country. When I said that babies have the highest poverty rate, that is because of this problem of this lack of maternity social contract. This is work that people have to do, however they choose to feed their baby. It's all feeding is work, and that work needs to be supported socially. It needs to be supported economically. Those scenarios I showed you that show that somebody, if they even bought a basic nutritious diet, would be almost $600 in the hole. We shouldn't be standing for that in this society. It's just not okay.
We have a hand raised in the audience. So if Jane Francis would like to come off mute and ask your question, please do.
Hi there, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh,
Acting.
perfect. Hi there. Thanks so much, Dr. Frank. As you know, I'm a huge fan of your work, and the work you're doing is so important. Um, so so I'm a doctoral student at the University of Toronto in nutritional sciences, so a bit of a different lens on breastfeeding and infant nutrition security, of course. But I'm working with a local Canada prenatal nutrition program here in Toronto, um, who received additional funding to provide postnatal lactation support to its CPNP participants.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of you on the line, the Canada Prenatal Nutrition Program provides prenatal services to vulnerable women across Canada. So this particular site we're working with has additional money to provide lactation consultant services to help women meet their breastfeeding goals. So my question is just, I'd like to hear your opinion on a couple things. So since we know that globally the most common reason women report for stopping breastfeeding or non-exclusive breastfeeding is insufficient milk supply or breastfeeding problems. Recognizing that breastfeeding support can't fix these root causes of household food insecurity that require adequate incomes, I'm wondering your opinion or what you think about the role of skilled lactation support, or accessible skilled lactation
Mm-hmm.
support, which is accessible is key, for helping food secure women reach their breastfeeding goals.
Well, I actually think it is important. It's important, and is the other stuff I was just saying.
Right. Yes.
So doing one without the other is kind of, you're just, it's difficult to achieve your outcome goals, right? And that when I was talking about the origin story of the book, that I actually was coordinating a CPNP program.
Right.
I was like doing lactation support and, trying to, and this is another rural problem, finding that one random good breast pump and delivering it at 10 o'clock at night when there's issues, right? And so those are some problems for rural women experience. And the thing is that the support that they need to overcome sort of those breastfeeding problems that arise for many people is just not there when they need it.
Mm,
So if
yes.
you're scared about having a hungry baby, you're going to make sure that baby's belly is full of something, right? So yes, we need better lactation support. Basically, my argument is that we do poorly at everything. We do poorly at supporting people to breastfeed in
Yep.
these circumstances. And then we do poorly at helping them feed them in any other way. And it's treated as if it's their individual problem and not a social problem, right? So what's challenging around, so yes, I would say, yes, it's important, but without ensuring the economic security of those mothers, they're never going to not be food insecure. You're just going to always have that problem. And there was something else I was going to mention, but and the other dilemma for CPNP program workers, people that are working, is how often they don't want to use program dollars for any, like, so say that the mother's not breastfeeding but needs support in help accessing food. They're discouraged through the sort of what I would call steering policies of the Public Health Agency of Canada to not get formula for them, right?
Yes.
You're not supposed to do that. So what ends up happening is that, in this I learned through interviews, that they help mothers on the down low and they're scared to tell anybody about it.
Yeah.
So they don't want to get in trouble. And then others say boldly, I don't care, because this infant has a right to food. But the Public Health Agency of Canada has not endorsed any other sort of programming dollars. It has for anything other than breastfeeding support and promotion.
Yeah.
Which is different from other countries, right?
Yeah. Well, and the CPNP hasn't increased any funding since the program started 25 years ago. So that's just a whole other issue, right?
Yes, absolutely. And it's not available across the nation.
No.
It's only available in certain locations, right? So in Nova Scotia in particular, we have, I think, 8 projects. So not every community has access to it. And, and there is some support for food insecurity problem. Like, so there's like food box perhaps, or you might get a carton of eggs, or you might get a thing of milk, or there's some sort of food supplementation for the mother's breastfeeding support. But there's no appetite in this country for food supplementation for infants.
Thank you so much. That's excellent insight. And I agree with all of that. So thank you so much.
Thanks for asking, Jane. I follow your work too, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Excellent. We'll talk.
Yes.
So I see we have another hand up there, but I didn't see who it was. So let's just see here. Whoever it is, if you'd like to come off mute and pose your question.
Sure. Hi, I'm Allison Milden. I'm also a doctoral student at University of Toronto working with Jane Francis on another part of that broader research program. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation and really appreciate your work. I just had a question about the stat that infants under 1 are more likely to be in food insecure households than any other age group. That's quite shocking. And I just wondered where that comes from, given that the CCHS doesn't track infant feeding and infant food security.
It's children under 1 are more likely to be poor, to be living in households under poverty. Yeah.
Poverty. Okay.
Yeah. So it's based on the low income measure.
Right.
So if you slice children, not slice them themselves, but if you slice by age, and it's a steady gradient. So it's highest in children under 1 poverty rates, and then it goes down to 18.
Which does make sense, because as you said, the income is lowest when you're taking care of a baby, which is when you most need support. So
and you're right. We can't calculate. We don't yet have the tools for calculating the prevalence of food insecurity in infants. That's the project I'm working on right now, is developing indicators for infant food insecurity that could be added to such a module that sort of get at, because the questions for children in the module talk about such thing as cutting the size of the child's field. So what we've done is selected a whole lot of indicators to test around that are particular to infants, like there's stuff around mixed feedings because of food insecurity, things like I water down infant formula to make it stretch, look for formula from food banks, that kind of stuff. So that's what we're working on right now. We're about to roll out a pilot survey to test them.
Okay, I was just going to ask you, do you have a research setting to test that in? Or potentially we could talk about that in our work, because we have plans for ongoing studies with the CPNP, and we did collect household food insecurity.
Yeah, so I've been interested in the data from CPNP because when I was working in the project, there was quite a robust data collection that I know got sort of whittled away over time. So I'm not sure the status of the data.
So in the sites, so I worked with 2 sites and Jane worked with 1 here in Toronto, some of the larger programs, and the actual CPNP data collection on food security was limited to just 1 question of if you ever experienced hunger during pregnancy. But in our research studies, we used the CCHS module and collected data on household food insecurity. So we're working on publications about that, and look forward to sharing. But it's great to hear about the infant measures. And if I can ask one other question, is that okay? Related to that, one of the things we found is that in our study population, there was a lot of food bank use embedded into strategies for getting food. So it wasn't the running out of food and then kind of the crisis and what should we do. It was actually part of the weekly food acquisition plan. And so the way the questions were framed didn't actually get at that, because some of the participants would say, no, I never worried about food because I use the food bank and I go to these 2 or 3 different programs, and so we weren't able to classify them as food insecure, although they clearly were. And I just wondered if you had thoughts on that and adapting that module to capture kind of that embedded use of charitable food as part of a strategy, such that the inadequate income isn't as much of a factor, but these people are clearly not able to meet their own food needs.
Yeah, that's a really, really important point. It makes me think about maybe, because I'm in the middle of creating the questions, right? We're working on building the survey. I mean, we are asking questions about food charity use, but I'm wondering, I'm just thinking about the placement of those questions and potentially like the filtering of them. I think you're right that you can perhaps not capture people's food insecurity because of their habitual use of food.
Exactly.
Because typically, especially for the book, the women that I interviewed for the book not all of them used food charity, but most of them used it as a ongoing sort of strategy it was an emergency response.
Right. And they're able to rely on that in the sense that they know they'll always get this proportion of groceries of this type of food from certain programs. And so we found sometimes they were answering the questions from a very confidently that things were okay, but it was actually depending on all this charity, so that's very interesting. I look forward to seeing that work and hearing more about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Allison. Some great connections here and sharing of resources and question ideas and data by the time you're done collecting it. This is my dog showing me his toy. He knows we're getting close to the end, I think. So we are, in fact, near the end. So I won't ask if there are any other questions, just because I am respectful and cognizant of the time. So I guess suffice that to say, a thanks is in order. Lesley, very much for your time this evening and being with us and sharing your information. We're delighted that we have a book, the book that you have to give away this evening. And actually, I'm even more excited to tell you that Allison Milden is the recipient of that book. So she won the draw prize. So Allison,
wow, thank you.
You're welcome. The Out of Milk Infant Food Insecurity in a Rich Nation is on its way to you. So there you go. And the other thing that I'd like to say just before we wrap up is to thank everyone else for being here this evening and sharing your questions, for those of you who posed them. We have recorded the event, so we will share that so that you can review it again or pass it along to whomever was not able to make it here this evening. And our next event is on March 22nd, and that one is Women in Government and specifically municipal government. So we have 3 speakers on the panel for that event, 2 of whom are Acadia alum. We've got Pam Mood and Emily Lutz, and then we have the Mayor of Wolfville. So hopefully you can join us for that session on March 22nd. I think there are lots of comments showing up in the chat box right now, Lesley, so you might want to have a look through them. But thank you again for joining us this evening. We do very much appreciate it. Thank you for everyone for coming, and thank you, Sandra, for the back end support on these events.